panel is about social media, tech, and AI for the future. So undeniably, artificial intelligence is definitely having what I like to call an it girl moment. Everywhere we turn, there are articles and cultural chatter about ChatGPT. I've seen it used at comedy shows. People are talking about Hollywood trying to use AI for profit. And the full spectrum of creative and business industries that we see impacted by AI is broad, not always to the benefit of workers and creatives. But what we don't hear much about is AI and tech's potential for social good, using the same traits that we see abused in some industries to create social change. So our next series of speakers is exploring and researching AI, social media, and tech within this very wide range. As is true with every form of technology that has advanced humankind, it's never sufficient to claim all good or all bad. So we're going to dig into the nitty-gritty right here today. And some crucial questions that we're going to ask are, what should we learn and know and think about big tech as we move deeper into an AI-ridden world, right? Maybe ridden might be a bit too judgmental, but we'll see at the end of this panel. You may have noticed we all share one thing in common, and I'm here to say we need more men in tech. That's the most important cause. Unfortunately, we did have some scheduling and health issues with some of the panelists who were here, so we did not intend to be four men talking about tech. And yet, here we are. So we're going to make the best of it, and I'll try to bring a little Taylor Swift flair. Not that you all can't. Please feel free. You can go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question about any of the presentations or broader questions. We will have mics going around to help amplify your questions if you have any, so feel free to dive right in.
Hi. My question is about implicit language. And if we can use it for evil, can it also be used for good? And how do we do that?
First of all, is it on? Okay, there we go. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a book a couple years ago that argued that any of the tools that are available for extremists or people who would use language for extremist purposes can also be used to the benefit of people trying to prevent the kind of violence that we see. I think to do so, you'd have to think about it almost backwards. Think about the kinds of people who might be hesitant to engage in positive social change and use the kind of language that alludes to kind of normative behavior, alludes to the idea that people would have fun doing things like positive social change, things like this activity here. The key are those three outcomes that I talked about. The idea that it normalizes violence, it gives people a positive attitude about violence, and it makes them think that they have the power to engage in violence. When I ran my studies, the one that I found was the strongest it's called perceived behavioral control. Do I have the ability and do I have the capacity to do this thing? And although I work kind of on the dark side of the way people affect change, I found that one of the biggest barriers to people thinking that they could prevent violence or provide off-ramps to people who might engage in violence is they feel like they have no control to do so. So empowering people by giving them the resources they need and by just bringing them together, and I mean, Katie's gonna love this. Katie, you can put this on the poster, but bringing people together to collaborate on certain kinds of projects that might undermine the kinds of messages that extremists say would be useful. So those three outcomes, I think, are the key to doing both, the norms, attitudes, and control surrounding the outcomes.
Just to real quick add to that, too, I think I want to focus on the use part of it. Like, I think one of you sort of shared the slide with, like, the same article distributed across all these different outlets. The extreme right has gotten really good at coordinating and distributing the content. And so even if we come up with the implicit language that will be effective for good, I think we still have to figure out how we all coordinate and distribute it effectively so that it becomes the norm. And I think that's the piece where a lot of times the left can be a little more fragmented. And I think we need to sort of come together to figure out how we coordinate and get the same message. Because if you look at like Fox News, like there's this clip online where like it's 50 different television channels that say the exact same line. And they've been investing in that for the last 50 years. And so how do we catch up to that, I think, is also a big part of the question.
And if I can make one more comment too, I would say it's even worse than that, in that there are media outlets that don't necessarily align themselves with the right or the far right, but they do the right or the far right's work for them by reporting on what the right or the far right said. So you can turn on, I mean, I've seen it quite a bit. Scarborough does it all the time. Like the leading thing on Scarborough's show is, what did they say on Fox News today? And that's just amplifying what's already been said. So I get what's being trying to do, undermine these sorts of messages by ridiculing them, but it's also important to remember to not accidentally amplify those messages. There's been studies to show that not so much Fox News anymore, which is weird to say, but like the OANs and the Newsmaxes, they serve as this weird conduit between far-right actors and kind of the larger public, and the left doesn't have one of those. And I would say good, because they shouldn't have a place in the media ecosystem anyway. But that conduit they serve, a lot of those messages, they just get picked up by every other outlet and amplified.
Hi, thanks for your insights. I wondered if there was I wonder if you have any insights into the step before the implicit language, in the sense of who is susceptible to it, not people who already have their positions and can hear the dog whistles, but those people who become attracted to these positions who wouldn't necessarily have done before, if that makes sense.
It does, and again, I hate to be cliche and go back to kind of the well, but it's actually instructive to look at things like charismatic leadership and the kind of personalities that people are drawn to before they start paying attention to the rhetoric they're using. So, because it's easy, I'll use former President Trump, but like people are drawn to him, his followers are drawn to him because he has a kind of some kind of magnetic charismatic personality, the way we define it. People are drawn to that initially, we found, and then once they're drawn to that, they start paying attention to the rhetoric more and more, and those are the ones that we find susceptible. And again, we have studies from the 1950s showing the kinds of leaders that drew in people like that, and it's cliche, but it's the Mussolinis, it was the Hitlers, and I don't mean to make a apples to apples comparison, but the leadership style is being emulated.
I'd say everybody in the world wants to be a part of something that matters. And unfortunately, people with good and bad intentions take advantage of that. So if we, I think, so some of the people who are more susceptible to this are, you often see misinformation consumed more by older people who are sort of cut off from their communities. And perhaps if you don't have an outlet in your everyday life to fulfill that very natural human need, then you're likely to be more susceptible to these kinds of messages.
On the flip side of that, we're also seeing young men lean more conservative on platforms like YouTube or Twitch, or sort of places where they can consume content like that from Joe Rogan, or sort of all these podcasts and networks that will push more conservative ideology. So I think we're seeing that too.
Last point I'll make on it too, with the young men piece, the biggest, about 2 years ago, on a project I was leading up, we had a workshop to identify what the next big extremist threats were going to be from the far right. And we found that the two were going to be abortion rights, and this was pre the revocation of Roe v. Wade. And then I was surprised by it, but through the conversation we had, it was going to be LGBTQ hate. And lo and behold, a year later, the groomer narrative pops up and everything else. And I got to thinking, and when I collated the notes to say, how did those conversations lead to that? It was that young men, young white straight men, because I know it doesn't feel like it lately, because generally the world moves in a progressive direction. Generally speaking, we kind of go like this. But because we generally move in that direction, people who benefit from the way things have been in the past, the way things have been in terms of legacy, they consider any kind of progress, or they can perceive any kind of progress as a loss to them in a zero-sum game that doesn't exist. And when people understand it that way, they feel as though they're being victimized, and victimized people look for the kinds of leaders I was talking about.
I've got a question for Ravi. You had mentioned that amplification and incentivization of opinions was really the core problem. From a platform design perspective, how can you change the algorithms, or how can we change how the content is being distributed?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, so I made my kale versus donuts analogy, right? And so if I pay attention to what a lot of these platforms are optimized for what you spend time consuming. Did you complete that video? What do you click on next, right? Which is akin to your, me eating donuts. So like, what do I, if you put potato chips or donuts in front of me, I will eat them. But if you appeal instead to people's aspirational selves, like what do you want to consume? And so people will tell you they want more educational content. They want more history. They might not finish the video, but they will tell you they want more of that. So how can we help people with their aspirational selves as opposed to their, a lot of these systems are about revealed preference, immediate engagement. So that's just one simple thing you can do. The other thing is really just not making these spaces, make them more democratic, make them, fewer manipulated spaces by small groups of people who often are more the extremes, and, have more everyday people participating. Because most people in the world are good people, but unfortunately the people we hear from online are not representative of that.
I think we've got another one right here.
Is it? Oh, there,
Yeah,
there we go. Got to go.
It's so you can't go like that.
Put it right into my face. Thank you for all of this. It's interesting to think of what motivates people, and also for both good and for ill. I'm also wondering if you've looked at the issue of disengagement, where people just throw their hands up and say, I don't know who's telling the truth. You're all full of it, and so I'm gonna go and watch cartoons for the rest of the day.
I mean, I can say a lot of people, there's a people that, a lot of people are disengaged from politics in part because online discussions have been so toxic. And so I think there's actually a free speech or engagement argument to be made that if you clean up these spaces, and so yes, you are, some people would say like, you're silencing me because my post that got 1 million views got 800,000 or something. But like, if you make it so that it's a little bit more evenly distributed, you might get more participation from a lot of people who just are turned off by like the ugliness, who just feel like they're going to be harassed by others. So there are a lot of people who are, I think, disengaged, and some of these ways we can clean up the system would help with that.
I think too, it's important to remember two things. Number one, people who disengage because they just kind of throw their hands up and go, I can't understand what it is, that's by design. That's an old Soviet disinformation tactic. It's called the fire hose of mistruth, where you just flood the environment with crap to the point that people literally don't have the mental energy to discern what's true and what's not. So we spent a lot of time talking about how the kinds of technologies, generative AI now, and social media can be used to amplify disinformation. A lot of those same tools, we're getting better at using them and recognizing disinformation. We're still a step behind, but things like generative AI and other kinds of disinformation, they come with little fingerprints that people are getting better at identifying. So I think what the key is, and again, I'll beat my war drum on this, is media literacy at a very nuanced level, teaching people how to recognize a deep fake, for example, relative to a real picture. And there are ways to do that. Like, I know if you look at two things side by side very quickly, then it's difficult to differentiate. But if you take a second, look at it, and you realize that this thing has 6 fingers instead of 5 fingers, then you can recognize that. But I think that comes with media literacy that needs to be taught in schools at a very, very early age now, so we can stop playing catch up and start getting ahead of it a little bit.
I think we've got one back here. Sorry.
I was actually
go for it.
Respond real quick. On the disengagement piece, I think we're also maybe seeing disengagement with tactics a little bit too. Like, I think more young people are tired of spending an hour watching the news, but maybe they're sort of a better way to communicate that info through short form content, through partnerships with creators where someone's doing a sustainable thrift sort of piece of content, but then talking about climate change and what it means to them. And so I think there's also like less investment in tactics that reach young people where they are. And so I don't know if sort of there is disengagement if we are not testing those tactics more.
And can I say one last thing? I'm sorry about this.
Go for
But
it.
there's a larger issue here too, which I think Ravi can probably speak to as well, is that there are no disincentives to the platforms to help people solve this problem, because disinformation, there's actually a statistic, there was some study that showed that disinformation gets 6 times as many likes, like 10 times faster than actual information. And that means clicks to the social media platforms, which are incentivized by financial profit, which comes from clicks. So I think the overall solution needs to be not just media literacy, although I've been harping on that. There needs to be a way to incentivize the social media platforms to tamp down in a way that makes sense, not content moderation, but in a way that makes sense and works with the user base rather than just tear things offline.
All right, finally, our long-awaited question back here.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I get nervous, so I wrote my question down. I have a question about news sources. So I feel like every day new discourse opens up about news outlets. One day the New York Times is the gold standard for print, and now the right says they're too liberal, the left says something about them being anti-trans, then the Washington Post has ties to Jeff Bezos or whatever. Where do I get my information from?
Reuters.
I mean, I just, do you ever get the sense that some of the people you see talk don't actually believe the things they say? They're just saying it to get attention or just to, because it's like financially beneficial to them. And I get that sense all the time. And so, and some people will admit it. If you read, BuzzFeed came to us, I was at Meta and said, and there's an article about this, that, they weren't proud of the stuff they were putting out. So I don't have a perfect answer for you, like you should go to this source, but what I can say is we should design these spaces so that the people who are telling the truth do better than the people who are not telling the truth. And in the world we have now, it is unfortunately not always the case. There's a lot of people who are doing very well by being misleading, sensational, dividing people. How do we just shift that playing field so that the people who are telling the truth do better? And then I think the right news sources will emerge. But I think as long as we're tilting the other way, then you see things like now the New York Times wants to engage in more clickbaity, fast news stuff, right? So we're kind of like hurting even the best news sources trying to compete in that bad world. And so, we have to shift the incentives back in the right direction, or else it doesn't really matter, though all the sources will kind of drift in that negative direction.
Good. Aaron, I'm going to scare you. Aaron was in my class you had 2 of my classes, right? Yeah, Aaron was in 2 of my classes, so I'm going to scare you with some statistics. I know he doesn't like statistics either. So I like to think of it this way. Saying, where do I get my news, it implies you should get your news from one place. And that's easy. That's the easiest way to go about doing it. But if you think about how wrong any single news source might be, it might be wrong to the left, it might be wrong to the right. But if you get your news from several different sources, over time, in statistical terms, the mean goes down to 0. You get something in the middle somewhere. So what I advocate for is, to the degree possible, engage with as many sources as you can, within reason. Like, don't go to, I'm beating up on them, but don't go to Newsmax because it's clearly, or don't go to like Russia Today or something like that. But get what seems like actual reputable news sources, several of them, get the headline, see what they're saying, and you'll probably approximate somewhere near the middle. You'll get something where the error for any one of those outlets is evened out via the other outlets. But that takes time, that takes effort. If we had some way to kind of centralize that, it would be easy, but that's beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, and it's a lot of times it's more of a question on how we can teach people how to consume news versus like where to consume news. I think that really underscores the sort of point about media literacy and, sharing with people how to consume news, because, 1 out of 2 TikTok users gets their news on TikTok, and so they may not even be going to any of the news outlets. And so teaching them more about how to go to the outlets and how to sort of do the different sources is important too.
If I could actually throw my hat in the ring just very quickly to answer this. I know I'm a comedian, but I used to work in journalism, and I left because somehow comedy was more stable than digital journalism. So here we are, right? I would very much echo Kurt's response about trying to find a variety of news sources. Like, speaking for me personally, not the institution I'm working with, I like watching Democracy Now!, which is an independent media source, but during the day, yes, Democracy Now!, we love Amy, Team Amy. But I will also, out of curiosity, watch the CNNs, the Foxes, the MSNBCs, to see what the landscape looks like. And I think, again, like Kurt said, you can kind of find the kernel of truth there, and I think it's almost impossible to be unbiased in news, right? Any editor that tells you they're unbiased is lying a little bit, right? Because we all have our own internal biases. We make choices about that have to do with the profit of the media website or the publication, right? So it is a bit of a business, and so I think you have to take that bias and consume the information knowing that. And oftentimes I like to do a little extra research, look up, see how many different angles have covered a specific story. And also I think finding trusted journalists. I will often follow freelance journalists at different publications that I trust, and I think have done great work, no matter where they're publishing their work. So I think, again, to Ashwath's point, finding creators that you can trust and finding journalists whose processes are transparent and productive are, I hope, good steps. But yeah. All right, let's move on. Do we have any mics here? We've got so many questions.
I have a mic. Hi, I'm Alana. I'm a journalist based in Baltimore. I know our friend that I met earlier this morning from Social Current said that people get their news from other people, and then the panel went on to talk about social media posts and how they might be harmful. Ravi, I'd love to connect more about LinkedIn and how maybe it's less harmful, but my question is really about sourcing. I saw a social media post, funny enough, saying, I don't like when journalists source from social media. I don't like seeing tweets and articles, which is something I do a lot as a millennial. I would love to hear y'all's thoughts on doing that or not doing that, because maybe it could be harmful. Maybe I'm putting a bias into my articles by using tweets or using social media posts within my publication.
I don't think you're doing harm by doing that, working as a journalist. My boogaboo with that, I don't mind seeing social media posts, especially if the story is about some sort of trend that the social media posts allude to. So I often see a lot of, given the stuff that I read, I see a lot of posts or a lot of articles where you'll see tweets from different politicians who echo something that another politician said. Something that bothers me that I see some do, and it's on less reputable type sites, is you'll see somebody say, this is a trend, people are outraged about X, Y, or Z. They'll post 3 tweets, and you look at the tweet, and there'll be 2 likes, 4 retweets. This person found 3 tweets, then they say, this looks like outrage. That, I think, is a bit disingenuous when people use social media posts to kind of build a narrative surrounding a story. Those are fewer and far between, but I don't think there's anything implicitly wrong with using social media posts to report on a story, especially if it relates to some sort of trend in relation to the story.
So I try not to judge as much as I can, but I guess I'd say, so I think, use it, don't use it, but I think the thing that comes to mind for me is that some things are meant to be hard, like some things should be hard. And I think sometimes some of these practices are because we've gotten so used to everything being fast and easy and quick. And so like the easy thing to do is to go find a source on social media versus, trying to interview people and talk to people and actually do the harder work. And I don't blame any individual journalist for that, but I do blame the system that has been created and that sort of incentivizes shallower work over harder work, where you might see more people go a step beyond the social media post.
Oh, all right. I guess I'm next. So I'm Filippo Trevisan from American University. So many questions, and I'm looking forward to engaging after the panel is over as well. Just one, it sounds from what Aaron was asking earlier on and your responses as well, that media literacy is really becoming so important and so much responsibility is being placed on us as individuals. It just reminds me of going back to grad school many years ago now, reading about focus groups of people in the post-Soviet period in Russia, and then saying, oh, I need to look at 20 different sources and then figure out for myself what's right and what's not and what I can believe, and like, are we becoming, or have we become some version of that now? As we move forward with AI, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge there when it comes to the individual and the type of responsibility that we have to educate ourselves? And then I have a couple of quick questions for Ashwath about maybe closer to the work that you do every day with your team as well. And in thinking about, I think it's great. It's really novel. It's different. It's a different way of thinking about engaging with different audiences and with this type of creators. Have you ever come across, the issue of, in any way, authenticity, and that we know, plays a certain role when we're engaging in more commercial campaigns, but in this space might play a different role? And then the second one is also something else I'm interested in and I do research on is around disability rights. And a lot of the influencers in that space are sometimes a little wary of engaging and kind of embracing a more activist or advocate identity. And I'm just wondering if you've come up against that, and how do you try to coach people and maybe win them over to doing some of this type of work? Thank you.
Cool. So we've got 2 questions for Ashwath. Do you want to tackle those first, and then we'll hit Kurt and Ravi? Cool.
Yeah. On the sort of authenticity piece, a little bit, a lot of our work is how do we find creators with lived experiences around issues to then talk about those lived experiences in partnership with our organization. And so we're starting from a place if someone does have an authentic story and wants to share it. And so we don't have to we don't have to do a ton of thinking around whether this will be authentic or not, because it is them and their story and how they're connecting it to an issue. So a little bit it comes up, but not a ton, and it might come up for certain issues versus something that might be more policy oriented versus issue centric. So it might come up a little bit. And on the sort of second piece around coaching up creators, I think it's not like a sort of one-off conversation. It is a process over time, and part of the process is doing some sort of test that is not the entire hey, I am an activist, I'm gonna do this work every day, but more of what's the entry point that we can start with that a creator is comfortable with? Because I do think an important thing to acknowledge is that it is riskier to talk about issues on social media as a creator, because a lot of times you might lose out on brand deals. And if you're a creator, that might be how you fund yourself. Or you might run the risk of Instagram labeling you as a political creator and then throttling your reach. They announced, 2 weeks ago that they're going to stop political content from coming up on the For You page unless you follow the creator. And so there are risks, and so part of it is having that conversation, understanding what this creator cares about, and over a period of time, coaching them to think through if they want to have an impact and the way that they can have an impact. And so we do that in a few different ways. We do briefings, we do sort of one-on-one calls, we do paid content. Once they actually do it and see their audience reaction, that can also be helpful. And so doing that, but it is a conversation that's important to think through for sure. And then back to the first question on the AI media literacy piece, I think one thing we're thinking about is speed. I think the speed that generative AI gives you is just hard to match. And so we're thinking a lot about how do these creators react to it in a fast way before it's too late.
Well, I'm just going to, sometimes it's boring if everyone just agrees on panels, so I'm going to take the opportunity to disagree a little bit and just say I actually probably don't think, I think media literacy is a reasonable thing, but so my graduate degree is in social psychology, and a lot of social psychology is about how people are in some ways very reactive to not their rational selves, but really the situation they're put in, to the social norms that they're in. And so I think if you design a system that encourages people to, try to consume news faster, to try to write news faster, to be more sensational to get attention, then you'll get very predictable results. And I don't think that teaching people some people will consult 20 news sources and figure that out. Most people are not going to do that. So I think we really have to design a space that encourages everyone to have better incentives. And then, yeah, media literacy is a fine tool in addition. But I think if you don't get the incentives right, then whatever you do with literacy is not going to make a big difference.
And I'm gonna apologize. I'm gonna agree with you, Ravi. So I'm gonna ruin your attempt to be throw a wrench in. But no, in addition to the media literacy piece, Ravi speaking made me think of something else. And this might be because I work in something called the AU core, and we really emphasize on all the AU people perked up. We really emphasize something called metacognition in the AU core. And I think another tool that we should be teaching people, in addition to not just how to identify disinformation, is to consider the emotions that you have when you're engaging with the actual content. One of the best bits of advice I ever got, and it has nothing to do with my academic work or anything, is when you're angry, when you're sad, when you're happy, consider how that affects the way that you're processing information. So if we can teach people that if they're angry about something, they're outraged about something, and they go looking for content in relation to it, think about what that anger does to the way you process that information before you take it at face value. Now, to your other question about AI, the biggest challenge, I think we got a taste of it in 2015, 2016, maybe even 2014, with kind of the rise and the growth of ISIS. Because ISIS was known as, they were like the most media savvy terrorist group in the world at that point, because they had, iStudio on their phones and they used it. But they also got very good at developing disinformation, including fake pictures, fake video. And it wasn't as good as we have now, obviously, but something that we saw kind of a premonition of what we're worried about now in the extremism space is a lot of violence is motivated by things like outrage, things like hopelessness. And it's not just those. People do, because people don't have certain things, relative deprivation, they're angry about it. It takes more than that. But think about a world where an extremist group wants to recruit somebody, and they know they can't recruit somebody without some kind of outrage, whether it be a war crime or whether it be the victimization of somebody in their in-group. You can pop on some sort of generative AI right now and ask for a picture of, and the generative AI platforms are getting better at saying, no, we're not going to make that picture. But you could ask for something about, show a soldier killing a child in a house or a pile of rubble. And they can do that, and it can be passed around as being evidence of a war crime by group A, B, or C. We actually, the newest conflict, the Hamas-IDF war we're seeing right now, both sides have used, well, supporters of both sides have used generative AI to try to implicate the other side in something that wasn't true. So we're seeing that be used already to try to get people to adopt their point of view through this new kind of disinformation. That's my big concern now. And the idea that we always track behind it, that's the problem. We need to find some way of getting ahead of it so we can warn people it's coming.
Great. We've got about 20 minutes left in our Q&A, so I'd say we can probably get to 2 or 3 more questions. Let's start right over here.
Yes, I'd like to dig deeper into how we hold platforms accountable, as your call to action was. We post content on YouTube. It's a historical content, and we often get flagged for very inexplicable reasons. And it's like we have to argue with a stupid robot just to get legitimate content out there. So how do we hold different platforms accountable?
Well, so if in a world of moderation, you are going to get mistakes like that, because even the best AI is being trained by a call center somewhere that is enforcing a policy. And so, the AI can embody that objective function really well, but it's still going to make mistakes, right? So I think, so how do we hold platforms accountable? My hope, we have our design code. We are turning into legislation for the state of Minnesota. I will do a talk at the FTC on Tuesday. I think we do need some legislation for minimum standards so that these platforms, I don't think platforms want to compete for our kids' attention by showing them videos that keep them on the platforms a little bit longer. Like, I think they would like a better solution for that. But I also think that they're caught in this race to the bottom where they can't give up market share to their competitors. And I think if we create some minimum standards legislatively to help platforms not have that race to the bottom, then we will need less moderation. You'll have your YouTube video because the incentives will be in the right direction. And then hopefully, we do our user experience measurement. We talk to people at platforms, we talk to advertisers and the investment community, and we're hopeful that if we can illustrate that some platforms are doing better than others, then hopefully that's one way to hold them accountable as well.
Very fantastic.
I am next. Hi, everyone. I'm May Cifuentes from the Riggs Foundation in Seattle. I'm coming to you from the field of public health, so I think about interventions a lot. I think about the science of communication, of behavior change, which requires motivation, ease of access, efficacy, internal, external. You're talking a lot about consumers spending a lot of time reading multiple pieces of information, which often exist behind paywalls. I don't remember the philosopher that talked about how human rights, in order for human rights to thrive, freedom of speech needs to be limited to some extent. So I want to shift the focus from the consumer to the business of media, and I was hoping that you can talk about the interventions that could happen at the macro level, considering that media is a business in the US, and that there's not really it's hard to have consumers engage in all of these things that you're talking about. Thinking about access to language or access to all of these different platforms, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about the interventions that could happen on the other side? Because it does feel like, we all want to use paper straws, but I think that, there's a bigger thing here.
I saw a comic once that said, like my socialist self leaving my body as my paper straw melts in my mouth and it shows the ghost coming out. I'm going to give it to the two of you to answer that question, because that question scares me.
I mean, one thing that really convinced me when I was at Meta that we had a problem was publishers coming to us saying they are doing things they are not proud of because they do better on social media. And that was politicians, that was small publishers, big publishers. That is a fixable problem. Like the algorithms that optimize for comments back and forth get very predictable, content that people, the more people argue about it, the better, health information, for example, shouldn't be optimized for comments back and forth. Some things are meant to be boring. They're not meant to be entertainment. So you turn health information to entertainment and you get predictable results where the best miracle cure or the most controversial COVID information gets the most attention, right? So I think not optimizing for engagement, optimizing for quality, and there's, I can share some papers about how platforms and people have done that, I think is how you shift the incentive away at the business level, away from some of the content that's harmful.
Yeah, I'm going to try to answer this, but I'm not sure if I will. But in sort of an adjacent space, some cool work that's being done in the immigration space is there's this org called Define American. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they do a lot of consulting with Hollywood on how to portray immigrants in film and in TV shows. And so they're trying to sort of start at the top to change how consumers consume this narrative. So I think that's one way to sort of think about what all the content is and how do we change that to incorporate more positive narratives. So that's one way. I also think sort of part of it is like the Harvard Chan School of Public Health Communications is doing some work with creators where they're trying to figure out how they can get creators to use more research-backed info versus just sort of spread mental health info that they, find online. And so they did an intervention with about 40 creators where they had 20 creators that had lived experiences around mental health and then 20 creators that were providers and talked about it. And they found them, they were using some research-backed info, but not a lot of it was scientific in nature. And so they took them through sort of a 6-week curriculum where they brought Harvard researchers and had them share info. And they found that after people went through that, after they got the briefs from research, they were able to produce content that was a lot more scientific in nature that included info that Harvard was doing in the public health space. And so I think that's a model where you can think through who is creating all this info and how do we change the info they're sort of creating to make sure it is more research-backed and fact-backed and sort of helps our narrative more positively. So I think there's cases, but I do think it's a big question we need to answer.
And my contribution, I come from actually way back when I was doing grad school, I was advised by public health persuasion scholars, so I'm familiar with some of the things that are done there as well. I'd be curious, I mean, I don't know of any work that does this, but I'd be curious to see like replications of the entertainment education type studies where, if you're unfamiliar with that, it essentially says that the best kind of persuasive messages in the health domain, if you want to get people to not smoke, for example, include a storyline in ER that shows somebody getting lung cancer over the course of like 6 episodes. And they showed that a lot of these network TV producers, they would work with like the National Institute of Health, like the place like that, to incorporate these messages into them. I'd be curious, I'd wonder if there'd be something related to media consumption, like that kind of storyline in one of those kinds of stories. The difficulty now is like who's watching network TV at this point? Like I don't know if the streamers will work with them or not, but I would be interested to see like an entertainment education kind of angle for intervention. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it too afterward.
This would be a great moment for the fishbowl, which we'll talk about very soon. We have time for 2 more questions, so whoever's holding mics right now, you're gonna have to duke it out and fight in the, no, I'm kidding. We'll start over here.
I don't know if I was gonna do that, but, so my question is about like, what are good practices for content creation and like talking with creators, or like, what do you think would be, I guess, general good practices that people don't think about that would be, I guess, supported in the algorithm to actually push good content? Like throughout this, I've been thinking about like what you said about people doing things they're not proud of. I think of everyone who starts like crazy story time or save this video for later. Or I was thinking also about there was a TikTok trend of a girl who was like cutting something and she was like, not to be crazy, but I hate store-bought pesto. And like people were stitching this over and over again because they were like, yes, that is crazy. Like people talk about like the most mundane of things in a weird, extreme way, which I think also makes, I don't know, the way that we engage with stories, like we only care about things unless if they are crazy. So what are good practices that you guys are finding of like reaching that truth and that authenticity and creating like content that people are proud of that still gets pushed by the algorithm? Because we don't all want to make rage bait content. We want to make things that are authentic to our stories and push truth out there.
I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to like rethinking who our trusted messengers are. I think, the common sense, especially when working with creators, is let's pick a creator who's an expert in this, who's already talking about this, and probably a political creator, an issue-focused creator. But I think sort of going beyond that towards more creators that have never talked about it but may have some sort of experience around it, and coaching them to talk about it might be a way to reach audiences more effectively. We did a campaign once around caregiving, and sort of the goal was to show people that caregiving is universal. And we did, a few different types of creators. We worked with fully unrelated to caregiving creators. We worked with, full-time caregivers. And then we took their content and ran it through message testing to see which, piece of content was more likely to move the audience towards believing that caregiving is universal. And it wasn't actually the caregiving content. It wasn't creators that were full-time caregivers. It was the ones that were sort of normal people that had a small relation to caregiving and just talked about it because people saw themselves in that more versus saw themselves in a full-time caregiver. And so I think rethinking who our messengers are and trying to find formats like this pesto story time or, fashion creators or whatever the format is, but just going beyond who we traditionally will pick towards creators that might not seem like the right fit, but possibly are, I think is what I would recommend and what we try to do a lot of.
So I unfortunately don't have a great answer in a world with bad incentives. Like you're sort of articulating my point that like there's no way to win, right? If you do you want to do stuff you're not proud of and get more distribution, or do you want to do stuff you're proud of? There are platforms that do better or worse. So we moved a lot of our communications from Twitter, which we just couldn't. I didn't want to engage in the incentives of that system, to LinkedIn, in part because the incentives were better. We got more high quality. We felt like we produced a quality thing and it got rewarded. And so different platforms will reward different things. And if you can find ones that rewards quality as opposed to engagement, then I would go there. And the second thing I'd say is like, think about the thing you're trying to post. So if it's an important topic, some topics I think are fine to be entertainment, like cooking or whatever. Like, some topics are not. Like, we don't want them to be entertainment. That there's a conflict between making it entertainment and making it good, right? Do you want our State of the Union to be the funniest thing ever? Like, I don't know. Like, it has to have some seriousness to it, right? In addition, maybe it could be funny too, but like, so some topics, I would also just think about the topic. Like, some topics are great for engagement-based systems, and some topics maybe are inappropriate for that. And maybe that's one way you could sort of be proud of what you post.
And I'll just add, I'm not an expert on creators, but I'm reminded of something that was useful. Again, I'm going to go back to the ISIS example, because there was a lot of positive media coming out to undermine ISIS at the time. And if you're interested in seeing what I think is one of the most effective counter-messaging campaigns made by an individual creator, the videos are probably still on YouTube. The user was named Abdullah X. And he was actually recruited by ISIS to deliver a package I think he was from London. I've met him, but I've never met him because his life was in danger. Like, I've talked to him online, but I don't know who he is. He is from London. And he created this series of YouTube videos that were about his genuine experience of being recruited by ISIS, about his hesitation and turn away from that. And they weren't just him. It wasn't like a talking head thing. He created kind of like these cool cartoon type videos that followed a narrative showing from his initial recruitment to the time he turned around. And he eventually turned that into a graphic novel that he sold, that sold pretty well in the UK. So I think in the extremism space anyway, someone's genuine experience and understanding what it's like to almost go down that road can be very effective. And in terms of domestically, because of the threat the far right poses at the moment, those kinds of experiences are useful as well, because all we get from interview data is showing that people who are recruited into far right groups, white power groups, white supremacist groups, like, they treat them like crap. They beat the crap out of them. They go through hazing, things like that. And all the interviews that we get from these kids who are getting recruited into these groups, they're not good stories, so they can be used in that way as well.
I would just quickly add, sorry, I'm just throwing in my 2 cents here. I do, since we're disagreeing and being spicy, I do want to push back a little bit against what Ravi said about entertainment. I think broadly some topics are not meant to be entertaining, right? But I think something that Katie would tell you if she were here, and I will absolutely endorse, is that comedy is a fantastic tool to educate and inform people. I think some of the best comedians I've seen use satire to talk about topics that are deeply serious and have very serious stakes, right? Last year, or 2 years ago, at this very conference, Joelle Nicole Johnson did a bit during her stand-up set about her abortion. I think of comedians like Tig Notaro who've done comedy about having cancer. Those aren't funny topics, right? But they kind of discover this universal truth through comedy, through satire, through parody. There's so many different styles of comedy that I think there's a possibility to use that to your advantage. I've created digital content regarding like misogyny in the gay community, and everyone's like, oh, that sounds like a downer. And we published it while I was working at Mike in 2016, and it did quite well. So I think, you really have to keep your audience in mind and think critically about what is entertaining and whether the thing that you're talking about is the butt of the joke or is the thing that people are left feeling like educated about, right? So using comedy as a tool to kind of get to that seriousness and couch it in something a little more fun at the beginning.
And very, very quickly, I want to make it, she'll love this when she sees the video. But I think comedy can be very useful. I'm by no means a comedy expert, but comedy can be used as a conduit to get people to search out more information. So absolutely. My wife, she was never really politically informed. She's still not psyched about politics, but she knows a lot more about it, and it's fully because of Jon Stewart. I am 100% sure that she would leave me for Jon Stewart. So now that he's back on The Daily Show, she's like, come on, we're watching at 11. I'm like, all right. So
we're actually bringing him on to replace you in this panel right now.
Yeah. It was probably her call.
So I'll just amend my statement. So I like comedy as a tool, I think amazing. I think there are people that we can all think of who are just entertaining, right? Like if you have something serious to say and you want to use comedy to say that well, great. But there are a lot of people I think we can think of who are just entertaining, and that is dangerous.
No, absolutely. And as we've talked about, a lot of social media sites do encourage people to be just entertaining and not necessarily include a fact or useful information. All right, we've got one more question over here.
Yes, I'll stand so people can see me.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes,
as well.
My name is Julie Drizzen, and she, her, and I'm on the staff of the School of Communications at AU, where I direct a center called Current, which is a 40-year-old trade publication, the #1 source of news for people who work in public media. And I got goosebumps when you mentioned Democracy Now! Because I'm a longtime public radio producer, and I launched that show in the 90s when I was the head of national news and public affairs at Pacifica Radio, which brought me here to DC. So I trust Democracy Now! And Amy, implicitly and passionately. And I also trust public media in all of its forms. So does America. Public media gets the highest ratings of trust across the board, and PBS actually studies that every year. And the things that I trust about public media is that it actually has a mission that is non-commercial, completely publicly accessible, and commitment to diversity, DEIAB. It has right now, in both public TV and radio, much greater diversity in both sources and on-air people and behind-the-scenes, and reporters than any other media in the country. I know that the Center for Media and Social Impact has long studied the diversity in public media and has concluded that fact. And the diversity of the documentary content that comes out of ITVS and the World Channel, Frontline, PBS NewsHour, Independent Lens, the diversity of PBS Kids. One of the things that I trust about Democracy Now! Is that it's doing very powerful, in-depth, daily alternative, radical coverage of what's going on in Israel and Gaza. So I highly recommend that. Other sources that I trust, and I hope that all of you will trust, are nonprofit news organizations like IRW, the Investigative Reporting Workshop that's based at SOC, like your local nonprofit news organizations, and Center for Public Integrity and Reveal. These are all great sources. I would also encourage you to check out the AI policies that have been developed by NPR and PBS so that it will maintain trust with its audience. I want to mention something about Current in particular. One is a few weeks ago, we hosted a webinar on AI, and my colleague Scott Talon attended it and said it was fantastic. It is available at current.org under the vertical called webinars, and anybody can watch that. That is in front of the paywall, and the people who participated were all public television people, and they made some very provocative examples of how AI has been negative and how it has been positive for public television. I also just want to say that Current does have a paywall. It's part of our business model. But anybody here can email me at julie@current.org, and I will lift that paywall for you for a period of time. So you can read any of our content under the AI vertical or anything else that's of interest to you to stay on top of public broadcasting. Now, having said all of that, I do actually have a question, which I know the answers are going to be brief. But I'm a mother. I'm very concerned about these developments for my children. I would leave my husband for Trevor Noah in a hot minute, even though he makes the best homemade pesto in the world. But journalism education is extremely important to me and the School of Communications, which has a vibrant, excellent, nationally renowned journalism program. What do you think journalism education should be doing to teach students about both the positive and the negative uses of AI that they are necessarily going to face if they're able to get a job?
If they're able to get a job, that's a good caveat.
So I think there are a lot of areas related to AI that a lot of people don't even know exist, especially in terms of the negatives. I'm hyper cognizant of one because my brother is a video game artist. And I hear a ton about how these generative AI models are trained on millions and millions of images generated by individual artists whose work happen to be on the internet. Some of which my brother is seeing some of his own work pop up in some of the generative AI models. So in terms of journalism education, I'm not a journalist, you know that. I have a general idea about how difficult a job it is to be a journalist. But I think one thing that we need to have up-and-coming journalists understand is that the positives and the negatives of AI aren't unidimensional. They go into places that we don't consider all the time. The main issue that I hear about AI all the time is disinformation, because yeah, it's important, but we don't think about as much about the artists who are having their intellectual property used, trained, and in a sense commodified by some of these platforms. So using that as an example, I would say think about the periphery of the issues just as much as we think about the central premises of the problems. Because for some people, a not insignificant amount of people, that periphery is critically important.
So there's a model of dealing with AI in the world where people say, like, you can't use AI to do X, and they will train a system to do that. I think that model is going to fail. Based on my experience, there's many open source AI models. You know, you can get the commercial thing that you interact with on OpenAI's site to act better, sure, but people are going to be able to create these things in other ways that are not going to be subject to that. So I think the proliferation of AI misinformation, this is part hope, but in part prediction, I think will just mean that we will have to do even better at trust and figuring out like some way in society to have quality and trust be the objective function that we aim for, as opposed to stuff that is engaging. Because people are going to be able to create an infinite amount of that other stuff that's untrustworthy and engaging, and so we will have to get better and better and better at filtering it. So my hope is that journalism will be even more important in the future, and that AI will just be kind of like the final nail in the coffin of like the engagement-based model.
I was a journalism major at GW, and I finished a year and a half ago, and we didn't have a single class on AI. So it would have been nice to have that conversation earlier. But I think what I would say is like understanding that AI is a tool, and it's a tool only, and understanding the limitations that come with that come with any tool, I think is important, along with what they said about sort of trust and the importance of it in the future.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is going to wrap up our Q&A session, so I get to let Ravi and Kurt and Ashwath free. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.